All right, we are back, Church History 101. This is what I'm going to call Chapter 2B, or not. 2B, that is the question, whether it's as nobler to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or they get to see of opposing troubles and by opposing in them. Okay, so we saved like the second half to talk about today, starting Church in the Pews on page 62. Now, this book skips over a bunch of things and it super compresses a lot of stuff. And that's, it's a shortcoming of a survey or a 101 level book that you can't do 500 years of church history justice in 10 pages. But one of the things I do like about it is we spent the first half of the chapter talking about kind of the big picture geopolitical theological part of it, and then we spend the next half of the chapter, today's chapter, on more of the interpersonal. Whenever it has a section about the church in the pews, it is trying to give a sense of, all right, we talked about the fact that there were these things that were being argued in the councils of the church, or this war that happened, or this controversy that was raging. But what did it look like for a Christian in their daily and weekly worship life? And kind of having that separated out is I think sort of interesting. It allows us to personalize, to humanize, to scale down some of the big picture stuff in a way that I think is a little more approachable for us. If we were to talk about, say, 2020, there's no way to talk about 2020 without, the pandemic and the shutdowns and the hospitals being overloaded and people dying and the economy falling apart and all this other sort of stuff. But there's also probably no way for us to talk about 2020 within also sharing about how it affected us personally. My friend who died, when I was in lockdown, and these are the ways that we handled it. This is the way that the crisis affected my family or my neighborhood. Or remember when we were doing church and you had to sign up online to reserve a spot because we were doing a different church service in a different building every hour, and that we had to clean in between, but you could only have like X number of people in the building because that was the rule from the diocese, and blah, 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 blah. So that's, again, what we're offered here. We had a lot of kind of major historical things that we talked about last part of the chapter, but we're going to get a little more of the personal perspective of what that is. Now, without the historical context, the stuff in the pews doesn't make anywhere near as much sense, because that historical context directly impacts what they were doing and how they did it, in the same manner that we can share a story about someone that we know and love who died in 2020, but the reason they died in 2020 and not some other year probably has everything to do with the very unique circumstances of 2020 that we had nothing to do with. None of us caused the pandemic. None of us made any decisions about shutting things down or how to wear a mask or not wear a mask or how far we're social distancing or all that kind of stuff. But in living with those circumstances, we all have that personal element where it made a direct difference in our lives that if it hadn't happened, our lives would look differently. So that's where we are. Their lives in the church in the pews look in a particular way because of what's happening everywhere else. And this is an interesting one. I love history, and I even like church history. I will say they express something here that I had never put together before. And I've taken church history classes, and it's not so much that the concept is new, but it was just so simply expressed. And that was the theological arguments of the early church, especially due to things like Arianism, kind of the classical heresies, were resolved. Now, that's not to say that there aren't heresies. That's not to say that these same heresies don't still exist, because they do. They just kind of, they sort of change and adapt. They sort of morph into something else. Pretty much there's nothing new under the sun. So heresies today, you can draw a line and you can connect it to some classical heresy. But the idea of there was a real competition about which side was going to win out, the apostolic faith or Arianism, for a good couple hundred years. This past Sunday, since it was the closest Sunday to December 7th, and I was in the sanctuary, I brought out the relic of St. Ambrose, of which I am custodian. And part of the agreement for me to still keep custody of this Orthodox relic was that I was supposed to bring it out in public and bless the people on a Sunday closest to the Feast of St. Ambrose, which is December 7th. So in case you don't remember, it's a little brass reliquary, and inside there's a little piece of Eucharistic chasuble that Ambrose wore in the 4th century. So anyway, I mentioned that to say the really unique element, and what's made a big difference to me about Ambrose, was he was the Bishop of Milan, and he is considered a saint, and he winds up getting the title Doctor of the Church, which is reserved for a select few theologians or writers who the universal church has said, these are basically like early church figures. What they wrote is so significant, every Christian in any age would benefit from reading it. So the whole story that's so essential to understanding Ambrose is the fact that in Milan, they had an Arian bishop and he died, and they needed to replace him. And there was, like riots in the streets. This massive disagreement about who was going to be what. Yes.
Can you explain what an Arian?
Okay, Arianism. This has nothing to do with like Nazis or anything. Nothing to do. Arius, the guy, was a priest and a theologian, and the doctrine that grows from his teachings and his supporters were referred to as Arians. There's no Y in there. It's ARIANISM. But anyway, the Arian theology is a Christological heresy, which basically says Jesus was not divine. He was just really, really cool. And because we know from the Old Testament that God is one, and that it is blasphemous to, have multiple gods and all this kind of stuff. So Jesus could not, by definition, be divine. He was something else. And Arianism sometimes had a variety of opinions about what that something else was, but it was never the essence of God. That's why the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Chalcedonian Creed to follow makes such a specific point of, God from God, light from light, very God of very God, true God from true God, begotten, not made. This was answering very directly questions of heresies like Arianism. Anyway, so there's like your riots in the streets about who is going to be the next bishop, and the Arians say it's got to be another Arian, and the Orthodox Apostolic Christians say, no, we got rid of the Arian, we need to go back to the Apostolic faith. And Ambrose is sent in as a civil servant to just basically keep the peace. Like he's just a governmental employee. He's not even baptized. He was raised in the church, but he was never baptized. And he goes and he makes this impassioned speech about unity for the sake of Christ and all this kind of stuff. And as the story goes, the voice in the back says, Ambrose for bishop. And he's like, wait, what? No. I didn't sign up for any of this. I just came here to keep you guys from freaking out. And, the crowd, chants his name. And that is his story where he basically says, I didn't sign up for this, but okay, God, if this is what you want me to do, I will do it. He is baptized and consecrated the same day. And he not just becomes a bishop, what a bishop he becomes. By his manner of life and by his writings, he makes a major impact throughout worldwide Christianity. Some of the things that he does and some of the influence he has on other people. The biggest being, it is said there are two things: the ceaseless prayers of his mother Monica and the preaching of Ambrose that brought Saint Augustine to the faith. So Saint Augustine is a guy we name churches after. Saint Augustine is a guy we name cities in Florida after. He writes Doctrine and Theology, which really underpins Western Christian thought. And this is all coming, stemming from a guy, I didn't sign up for this. Anyway, we backtracked into the early church to say those issues have been resolved. The Arians lose. Apostolic faith wins the day. And because those issues are resolved, and that's not to say they disappear completely, but it's to say they're now a vocal minority. There's no danger of Arianism like sweeping over the church and taking everything over anymore. So because that happens, the church as a whole changes its focus. And this is what I found, the way that it was explained was really lovely and simple, and I'd never seen it explained so simply, that when the argument is about the divinity of Christ, you have got a real rival, and the outcome is uncertain. But that rival's position is Jesus is just a man, just a man. Then your position as an apostolic Christian is to emphasize his divinity, to make sure that everyone is very clear that he is, the apostolic faith is fully divine and fully man. It is both and, it's not either or, but the man part was never in dispute. Both sides agreed on that. So if they disagree on his divinity, well, then the Orthodox position is to really emphasize his divinity to make sure that that doesn't get lost. So we have, the first several hundred years of the church where the iconography of Christ, the preaching about the nature of Christ is really, really emphasizing power and divinity. That gets resolved. And now, because you don't have to hammer the point home anymore, the humanity of Christ now starts taking prominence. And this is where we get to this church in the pew thing. So the devotional life of your average Christian starts to really kind of transform because the church as a whole begins to kind of reconnect with the humanity of Christ. Not that it was ever lost, but it becomes underemphasized because that's the one part that's not in dispute. And so if you don't have to argue about it, you set it aside. But now the church is preaching and teaching, the iconography changes, what people paint or they write about devotionally or whatever, it starts emphasizing the humanity of Jesus. Jesus as humble, Jesus as the healer who touched, Jesus who, the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. He's, being cared for as he goes. His suffering on the cross, even the suffering, the inherent human suffering of the incarnation. Jesus who feels hunger, Jesus who feels thirst, Jesus who feels physical pain, Jesus who cries out at the crucifixion, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus whose dead body is then laid in the arms of his mother and then laid in a tomb. So those things for quite some time within the devotional life of the church were sort of set to the side, and they kind of come rushing back into prominence. And so that makes an enormous difference in the pews when for a long time it's been, the power of Christ, the divinity of Christ, the omnipotence of Christ, the majesty of Christ. And now all of a sudden, it is his tenderness, his solidarity with us in our own human experiences. The elements of his life, a life of service, a life of suffering, a life of love. And once those become prominent again, it's shaping how people worship on a daily and weekly basis, and it's shaping how they are understanding themselves in relation to Christ. What he refers to as kind of an evangelical renewal, that is a renewed emphasis on the good news of the gospel, is that good news that in this society, so here's again the overarching society and then the daily human life, and it's a couple of things. Remember last week we talked about there were sort of three major issues within the world that was shaping everything, and number one was the connective tissue was the church. It was the church that was uniting people and cultures and was sort of setting the tone for everything. So this being a feudal system, not futile, feudal with a D, the Lord, who then has people underneath him who work for him, and then that Lord has a Lord above him, and he kind of works for him, and you have this interconnected system, but there's nobody really in charge. It's the church as a whole that is kind of the unitive whole, and then you've got lords here and lords there locally, and then smaller units connected underneath. So most of the people are on the underneath. The largest number of the population are not the lords, it's the peasants. It's the people who are working the farms of a local lord, who then himself is basically working for the bigger lord, who's working for the bigger lord, so on and so forth. So imagine then the difference it makes for the peasant, instead of being told constantly about the majesty and power and omnipotence of Christ, about Jesus who led a life that looked an awful lot like yours. A Jesus who was not an important rich person who had people working for him. A Jesus who had a very simple, straightforward means of life, who visited from place to place and nothing seemed fancy, who sometimes struggled to find what was necessary to eat, and his best friends were fishermen. These were not nobles and lords and feudal stuff. These were very simple sort of people. And it's like, he's like you. And that does a couple of things. It's super popular today to talk about representation matters, representation in media. If I don't see somebody on the screen, the TV screen or the movie screen that looks like me, well, I can't identify with it. They need to be my skin color. They need to be my ethnicity. They need to be my gender. They need to be my political persuasion. They need to be whatever. It's super popular these days, super popular. So I'm going to say there is something significant about seeing yourself in someone else. So these peasants were seeing someone in Christ that they could then connect to and relate to on a more personal matter. And I think there is something significant to that. But what also becomes significant is if I can understand his life, like he was kind of a peasant like I am, well, then my life can look like his. That's the real difference. Now, suddenly, your average, everyday Christian peasant could say, well, how is my life currently reflecting the life of Jesus I'm being told about? And can it be even closer? Oh, he served the poor. I can serve the poor. He blessed the sick. I can bless the sick. He preached the kingdom rather than built wealth. I can preach the kingdom rather than build wealth. You know, so suddenly people in their own lives are trying to emulate Christ as a practical example. That's an element of the devotional life that had sort of been lost for a period of time. And that's reclaimed. So when we mentioned somewhat offhandedly about the growth of the monastic movement and people like Francis of Assisi, here's the direct connection. You know, because the church is not fighting the battles of defining the basic terms of orthodoxy, that humanity of Christ is then allowed to sort of flourish in what people think about and do. And then you've got people like Francis who are like, in the incarnation, Jesus gives up. He empties himself, taking on the form of a servant, as it says in the New Testament. Maybe I should do that too. He was a rich young man. Maybe I can empty of what I possess in order to serve others just like Jesus did. So some of these monastic movements grow out of this very direct connection to, by seeing the humanity of Christ as important, I not only identify with that in a way that's meaningful to me, but I can actually work on looking more like that all the time. I can't work on looking more omnipotent. I can't try a little harder to be, you know, divine and magisterial. There's nothing I can do, but I can make some choices about, does my human life look like the human life of Jesus? And so that's kind of where we are with that. That's where the overarching societal issues filter down in some very interesting practical ways to everyday Christians. A lot of the practices of the church start to codify and solidify at this time as well. So again, we're going to relate to these changes in wider society. If you are arguing about the nature of Christ, if you are arguing which book should be in the Bible and not in the Bible, you're kind of focusing on one level of basics. But once that all gets resolved, you now can start doing other things. And just like we talked about the humanity of Christ regaining prominence, a lot of the devotional and liturgical practices that we take for granted or we consider to be very old are really either coming from this time period or being really nailed down in this time period, because they're not arguing about the fundamentals. They are now able to take those fundamentals for granted and now talk about how should we apply them. So obviously Christmas and Easter are major feasts of the church. The Feast of the Resurrection, I think we either talked about this last week or the week before that, calculating Christmas and the Annunciation and how this all works out. Well, they didn't have to do that for Easter. Easter, they knew when the early church knew when Easter was, because there were enough people alive. There were enough people who saw it that you didn't have to work backwards and guess. There is an element of guesswork to Christmas because nobody was thinking, oh, I better write the date down because a shepherd told me that wondrous things had happened. And my guess is in 50 years, we're going to be really glad that I wrote that this was a Tuesday or whatever. So anyway, again, remember, if the church is fighting for the first few hundred years about the nature of Christ, divine, human, all this kind of stuff, obviously Easter and the resurrection, we know the dates, and this is what we're arguing about. We're arguing about his divinity, his ability, his nature, his essence. So Christmas is less significant for a variety of reasons. Well, if we're going to recapture later on talking about his humanity, because those older arguments have been resolved, well, what's going to naturally gain prominence at Christmas? Christmas starts gaining prominence as a principal feast of the church right alongside Easter. It hadn't before. It was always there. It was significant, but it really kind of, think about what we were just talking about. If you are reconnected with the humanity of Christ, that really points more to Christmas than does to Easter. The Easter really points to his power, his majesty, and his divinity. It's Christmas that points to his humility and humanity. Humans are born. Humans are babies. Humans used to be in the wombs of mothers, and then they come out and get wrapped in swaddling cloths. That's what a human does. And so Christmas gains a new priority because if we're talking about the humanity of Christ and we're kind of pondering it in a devotional way, then thinking about how God empties himself, not just taking on the form of a servant, but taking on the very weakest element of humanity. There is nothing weaker than a newborn baby. You are wholly and completely dependent upon the care and attention of somebody else. Newborn babies cannot survive on their own. They just can't. What is more helpless? What is more fragile? If you're fighting over divinity and majesty and power, you're not spending any time on how fragile baby Jesus was, right? But now, as you are you're kind of wondering and praying with a sense of awe and praise about how Christ really took our weakness and our sinful flesh. And then you start thinking about Christmas, because that's a very direct example of the humility of the incarnation. So it is St. Francis of Assisi himself who is credited with the nativity scene as a way to teach the gospel story and to reconnect with the humanity of Christ. So what we would consider the stable and the star and the baby in the hay and the animals and the shepherds and the wise men, all that kind of stuff, this is the time period where that symbol starts taking shape. And it's been in a variety of ways over the centuries, but we really have the medieval church to thank for what we consider to be a nativity scene more than we do the gospel. The gospel is scant on its details about what it actually looked like. He was laid in a manger. There was no room in the inn. The shepherds were in the fields and they saw the star and they came, the angels there and the shepherds come and they see and they go tell everybody else. But this sense of the stable barn structure and the wooden little, when you are in Israel, we were looking at a field once and we walked past a manger and I didn't even realize it until the tour guide said, yeah, that rock over there, that's a manger. They didn't have a lot of spare wood, but they did have this, kind of volcanic basalt rock that's just kind of strewn everywhere. And using wood to construct a feeding trough would be kind of a waste of good wood. Mm-hmm. But taking one of these rocks, especially one that already has kind of a dip in it, and maybe chiseling it out a little more or whatever, you can throw some hay in that, no problem. You can throw some water in that, that's easy. And the animal, and it's durable, it can stay outside, it's not going to rot or break down, and the animals can use it at any time. That was a manger. That was a first century manger. It was rock, it was stone. And when you go to the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, you are not looking at a recreation of a barn, you're going into a cave. And that was far more likely to be the place where animals and their feed was stored. because there was a cave, there were caves there. So why build something when the natural equivalent already exists? Not real nice for people, but it's perfect for animals and it's perfect for food storage. Anyway, it's stuff like that. It's because of these Middle Ages and the devotional needs of the church. We want to connect with the humanity of Christ. I read the story in Luke chapter 2, and I wish I could just see it because it's so profound to me that an almighty God could be a helpless baby. And so it's people like Francis, and then we're working through now the devotion life of other churches and other places, kind of meeting these pastoral needs to connect devotion with scripture and some kind of liturgical practice. Yeah.
Another thing, this was, the Middle Ages took place more in the European area, right?
Yeah, we're mostly concentrating on Europe, yes.
Right, and that was full of trees. You know,
Oh, sure.
forests.
That's right.
They didn't have the same setup as Israel did, and they couldn't get to Israel to see how they were set up.
That's absolutely right. So and that this is the other half of a major devotional practice that we're talking about that's stemming from this time period, and that is the Stations of the Cross, that is the Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering, that is the way in Jerusalem to take a pilgrimage so that you could be where Jesus was. And again, I have done a pilgrimage. I have stood in some of these places. I have touched things that Jesus could have potentially touched. This was in Magdala. This was where they had uncovered from the sand after it had been buried for almost 2,000 years. They didn't uncover this thing until the 90s. And they found the synagogue of Magdala, where Mary Magdalene was from. It was in one of those towns that Jesus was continually going through and preaching and teaching. And if Jesus was in a town on a Saturday, where would he be? He would be in synagogue. And they uncovered this thing that was buried under the sand and dirt. And the benches where the men sat just a big piece of carved stone. And they can tell by the orientation, this is the side the men sat on. And you better believe I reached around the ropes when nobody was looking and I touched that bench. Because some of these buildings were made 1,000 years ago. Some of these buildings were made 1,500 years ago. But we have every reason to believe Jesus sat on that bench that I touched. So I will tell you absolutely, it means a difference to actually be in some of these places. Absolutely. I can't describe it any more than to say it's sort of indescribable. So again, reconnecting with the humanity of Christ, people are starting to think, I wish I could go there too. I want to touch what he touched. I want to see what he saw. When we get the gospel account of Jesus asking the disciples, who do you say that I am? That happens in context of being at Caesarea Philippi. I have sat at Caesarea Philippi and heard those words repeated. And I'll tell you, it means something different when you're actually there. When you are on the Sea of Galilee and a little storm pops up out of nowhere, and then you hear somebody talk about Jesus falling asleep and then being woken up and saying, "Oh, ye of little faith, peace be still," it means something different. So from all over, people were saying, I want to see these things. I want to touch these things. I want to be where he went. Well, you can't hop on a plane in AD 900. There was a way to take a pilgrimage, but it took forever. It was very expensive. These were peasants. They were subsistent farmers who owed a lot of their crops to the Lord who owned the land. They couldn't just say, you know what, I'm going to be gone for the next 2 years. If only for the fact, like, what would you eat along the way? But people were still trying anyway, and it was also dangerous. You know, there's no highways, There's no police departments. You could be robbed, you could be killed, you could lose your way. There's no, you can't look GPS if you should have turned left instead of right. So this was an enormous undertaking. And so in order to offer this devotional connection that seemed impossible for most people otherwise, the Stations of the Cross, as they had been identified in the city of Jerusalem, are now being reconstructed locally. Someplace you could get to. Maybe it's 3 towns over. But that's actually doable, whereas walking across the world is not. And so what we would have, say, even in our church, with just the 14 stations in different representations lining the walls, to somebody who had nothing, to have images where you could actually spend a moment at each one and remember some part of the story was life-changing. So they were constructed, you know, the first ones were probably more elaborate, but then it was like, well, smaller and smaller places started saying, we can do that too. We can make representations, we can make pictures, we can make, you know, whatever. And so that grows into something that any church can do. And it grows into just kind of an accepted devotional practice. And even if you like, you know, why go to the non-denominational church across the street? We don't do Stations of the Cross. Okay, but you know what they are. You could do one if you wanted to. You probably sat and thought when it gets close to Christmas that even if you don't like observe all the days of Holy Week, you maybe reread a portion from one of the Gospels and you imagine. That's exactly what's happening here. So the seasons of the church year start taking their shape here. Some of the ebb and the flow of feast days versus fast days, big celebrations, small celebrations, seeing how the calendar is reflecting the gospel story, and it becomes the rhythm of your daily life. This is the time where that really starts to crystallize. Because again, in the early church, they're still kind of fighting about the fundamentals, and for several hundred years, they are being persecuted off and on. Maybe they have to hide what they do, or maybe they have to, like we talked about Orthodox Christianity, pick up what they have and run for it. So you're not going to be worried about 40 days of Lent and a fast and the 4 Sundays of Advent and its preparation if you are only able to worship in secret and in a different location every time. So it's kind of the luxury of having the faith not just open and public, but it's the connective tissue across this entire area of the world. That's the common humanity between somebody who is living in Francia versus someone who is living in the Holy Roman Empire versus someone who is living in the British Isles. It is the life of the church. And these devotional elements are now kind of becoming spread and common all over the place. And it only makes sense that we found out that, this church 5 towns over did this thing and it really made a big difference. We're going to do it too. So this is how some of the kind of the macrocosmic issues have the microcosmic interpersonal effects. A lot of the things that we just kind of take for granted as far as the structure of worship and devotion and liturgy and everything else, a lot of it is coming from this time period. So yeah, now to work backwards just a hair, the Station of the Cross. Remember, this is like, pilgrims coming and the ones who do make it to Jerusalem and saying, well, I want to know where this stuff happened. And so trying to use the local knowledge, trying to use that which has been preserved over the generations or whatever and identifying or having identified where these locations were. When you walk the Station of the Cross, in my mind, I guess I had imagined that in the old city of Jerusalem, the Stations of the Cross were a little more standardized with distance. Now, I mean, I knew they wouldn't be like, it's exactly 17 and a half paces, whatever, like when you put a Station of the Cross in your church, or maybe you do it in a garden outside or whatever, they're like regimented and they're all kind of an equal distance apart. When you walk the old city, it's like, here's the one station, we're going to go 3 blocks, and then there's like 3 stations right in a row, bang, 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 and then it's 2 blocks, and then there's 2 stations almost on top of each other, and then you might have to go a pretty good distance until you find another one, because they're just places in the city. Now, are these the exact locations of where these spots happened, or were they sort of recreated after the fact? The answer is, I think they did their best. But, would I swear for sure that where Jesus falls the 3rd time was at this corner and not on the other side of the street? No, I would not. This is also the part of time where so many pilgrims are coming that they start to build a lot of these structures and churches to commemorate sacred spots. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, this is where we believe the tomb of Christ was. We're going to build a structure, a worshipful, devotional temple on that location. Now, are you absolutely positively sure it was right there and it wasn't 6 steps to the side? Well, no, but the people who did it at the time did their level best. And this was very, very early. It is, I believe it's the wife of Constantine who winds up having a lot of these things constructed. So we're talking about, this was relatively early on. But when you are in the old city, a good tour guide will identify time periods where certain structures were built. And a lot of them they refer to as Crusader churches, because within those few hundred years of Crusades, they would either pick a spot and say, well, this is where we're going to commemorate this event, or they knew where the spot was, but they didn't think that it was, whatever was there was appropriate enough to convey how significant. So we're going to build something magnificent right there that will last forever. And so when the new pilgrims come, they'll know exactly where to go. So you have some structures that predate the Crusades, some structures that are built during the Crusades, some that are built obviously after the fact. Some of these places existed, they were there when Jesus was there, and they still remain, or at least pieces of them still remain. But a lot of things have been built over, even preserving the older stuff, because the more pilgrims who come, the more you want them to be able to understand where certain things were, and you want those things to have an appropriate level of reverence and significance for what it is. So again, this is where a lot of the devotional practices are really being codified and solidified. So you can't really talk about Crusader churches without talking about the Crusades. We mentioned them very briefly. Even this chapter doesn't do, I think, anywhere near as much justice on the Crusades as we could do. So remember, another one of the 3 major things that I talked about last time about these are the significant issues within the world, and one of them was the rise of Islam. Okay, so that's starting in the 7th century, and Islam burns like fire. And it's spread by the sword. There's a lot of conquering and saying, well, you're a Muslim now because we took over all your lands. So it cuts the church in half. It cuts the world in half. It tries to spread deep to the west, but it only really manages to stay in the southern part of that. But it gets all the way as far as the Iberian Peninsula and Spain, Portugal, North Africa, so all around that Mediterranean area. But the Christians kind of stopped them multiple times. so they do not push into the bulk of Western Europe. But there's now there's not just a theological divide between the East and the Western Church, there is now a geopolitical divide of Islam right in the middle. And the Western Latin Christians are on this side, and the Eastern Orthodox Byzantine Christians are on the other. And you really can't go without the Muslims saying it's okay for you to be here. And sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't. So what's in the middle? Some important things, like the Middle East, like geographical Israel, like Jerusalem. Those were all conquered very early on through the spread of Islam. Islam, if it's coming from Saudi Arabia, that's where Mecca and Medina are. You know, the Middle East, Israel, Sinai Peninsula, that's not very far away. So those are things that fall first. The impetus for the First Crusade is basically twofold. It is the Christians who have been making these life-changing pilgrimages to Jerusalem. It's no longer safe for them to do so. They are being killed along the way. They're being, sold into slavery. They're being denied access, whatever it is, because they're going through these Muslim lands that we have no control over, and they don't want us there. If you're not Muslim and you're going into a Muslim country, you're a second-class citizen, and maybe they're not going to let you in at all. So now they're being prevented. The second thing, and this is probably more significant, is how can we let the holiest places be under the control of the infidel? So Jerusalem was conquered and taken. We need to get it back. So it is it's exceptionally common to see the Crusades as this, kind of aggressive, sort of imperialistic. You're just being mean to the Muslims, and they are different than you, so you're going to destroy them, and it's not fair, and blah, blah, blah. At the time, that is not at all how it was seen. At the time, it was seen as a defensive struggle. They have taken our home from us. We need to get it back. They would say Islam was the aggressor. They came into our house and they stole it. Now, Islam, who had now been there for a couple of hundred years, well, this is ours now. It's our home. You're coming into our home. So it is a difference of perspective about who was the aggressor in the Crusades, at least in that First Crusade. The First Crusade successfully retakes Jerusalem. It institutes the Kingdom of Jerusalem. That might be Baldwin the First. I'm not sure. I get my Crusader kings mixed up. My time frame's a little wobbly, and this glosses over things so fast it doesn't give much on dates and times and people. But it doesn't last. So it gets reconquered. Second Crusade, we're going to try again. Third Crusade, we're going to try again. Most people, when they think of the Crusades, think of, in your head, you have a mix of the first and the third. I'm just telling you, that's what is like. The First Crusade, which is out of nowhere, we need to take this back. And the Pope saying, we've got to get Jerusalem, and this, this will get you time off of purgatory or whatever, and people painting the red crosses and all that kind of stuff. And then the Third Crusade, where you've got kind of famous names and faces, Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, the Sultan, the kind of historical figures you think of are more associated with the Third Crusade. Yes.
What were the Jews doing during this time? What was their attitude? Were they just the conquered peoples, and they were just too much of a...
Pretty much the Jews got it from every direction. Neither the Muslims nor the Christians wanted the Jews around and treated them pretty terribly. The Jews who stayed in Jerusalem became subjects. There's a whole thing that we can talk about what is it like to be a non-Muslim in a Muslim country, and the concept of dehimitude, and your sort of second-class citizen status, and what it means. But even in Europe, where some Jews had kind of naturally migrated to, some had fled to, they were routinely persecuted. And especially if you're going to talk about going back and taking Jerusalem, it's like the Jews who were bothering nobody caught it all over again. Because if we're going to Jerusalem, oh, that reminds me, weren't the Jews from Jerusalem? Man, and they killed Jesus. Come here, come here. Like, what did I do? You know, but the blood was boiling at that point. And so the Jews were catching it from every direction. Whether they still lived in the area of Judea, or they were someplace in perhaps Western Europe, or in Byzantine Christianity. This is going afield of what we were saying. Though the historical presence of Jews in Jerusalem and in the surrounding area is thousands of years old, there has been no from the loss of the southern kingdom of Judah, there was no Jewish nation or state or country until 1948. They were simply a persecuted minority wherever in the world they were. So there was no safe haven for them anywhere, not until 1948. And that was the whole, that was essential within the recognition of Israel as a state, that especially after the Holocaust, and especially after the way they were treated by other countries as they fled the Holocaust, and they were told, no, we don't want you to come here either. We don't care if you die. They had to have a place that was theirs. Otherwise, they would, you know, just continue to be destroyed wherever they were. So anyway, back to the medieval times. So here we are in the Middle Ages, and the devotional life of the people, and a lot of these things we're talking about with the liturgy and the practices, the church calendar, whatever. This is where a lot of it really takes shape. Now, I want to mention a historical kind of an overarching thing that really sets the tone at the end of this time period and as we move into the next one, because it's really happening now. And that is, remember how the church is the real connective tissue all over, because there are no real nations. There are these feudal lords, and some of them have influence over a larger area than another, and languages start to coalesce and stuff like that. But the concept of your identity as a part of a nation is still not really there. You're connected to a place, you're connected to a feudal lord, he's connected to other feudal lords, but you wouldn't say like, I'm French, because there's no such thing as a France. This is the time period where that starts to happen. On top, the biggest feudal lords start consolidating their power, and they start trying to take a greater degree of control and authority over their area. And one of the ways to do that is to have the people feel united and some kind of commonality that ties them together under you, versus being, well, if everybody's connected to the Pope, then my power is always subservient to his. But if you're connected to me or this area which I control, well, then suddenly these guys on the top now have some borders where they say, I'm really the authority in this area, not some guy in Italy that no one has ever seen here. It's me. So as that starts happening, you've got a kind of a natural outgrowth, which is going to shape the next few hundred years. And that is what happens when one major feudal lord who says, this is my area, has a disagreement with another feudal lord who says, this is my area. How do you solve that? I mean, typically you solve it through warfare, but remember, before you started saying, this is mine and everybody here is connected to me, we're our own thing, different than you. We used to be connected through the church, but now we're connected to more like a place, a language perhaps, as the languages start consolidating. Other than warfare, the other way is for the Pope to reassert authority, say, no, 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 no. I will solve, I'll negotiate this problem or whatever, because ultimately we are all still connected through the church, right? Right. You're a Christian, I'm a Christian. Yeah. But that also then says, who's the authority of these feudal lords now becoming kings? Well, it's the Pope. Well, these kings don't like that idea. Here in my kingdom, I want to be in charge, not the Pope. So this happens in a few locations. One of them is these disputes between England and France where they've been fighting each other forever. And the Pope starts saying, okay, I'm going to solve this problem. And both of them say, oh, no, you don't. Both of them decide they're unhappy with the Pope. And we're going to get to this time frame. It's going to be a couple of 100 years where, because the Pope tried to and unsuccessfully assert authority over these changing geopolitical landscapes, these kings start fighting back. And these kings start arguing with the Pope, disputing the Pope, and on a couple occasions, they will kidnap and kill popes. We will have a little stretch of time where there will be more than one Pope, where a powerful country will say, you know what? Forget you, we're going to name our own Pope, and he's going to let us do what we want to do. And now you start having well, which one's the real Pope? Well, we like this guy because he was there first. Yeah, but he's a dummy and nobody listens to him. Our guy, everybody loves him. And, people should, and especially when popes run away and hide. Do you give up the job? Or are you still the Pope? And the other Pope, because you're hiding and nobody knows who you are, they think you're dead and they have a new Pope. Well, now he comes out of hiding and there's two Popes. So you're going to have this period of time where you will hear about an anti-Pope. And all this really is a series of internal but extracurricular disputes between countries where the church is unsuccessfully trying to keep the peace, and you are having these countries then try to assert control back over the church. We're going to name our own Pope. We're going to kidnap you and keep you hostage or whatever it might be. So we're entering a very, very messy time period where that connective tissue being the church is really being challenged. And what we will see as we move into the next section is what the outgrowth of that dispute becomes.
What's the name of this time period?
Well, I don't know what, I didn't actually look. The next one he's going to call the Reformation Church. But we will be moving, as far as Western Europe is concerned, we'll be moving into the Renaissance. This dividing line is about the 1500s. So we're moving to the Middle Ages, which is generally considered to transition around the 1500s. All right, so next time we will come together next week before we take some time off. Let's go all the way to 92. That will be the halfway point of that chapter. We will stop at the church and the pews like we've been stopping. So we'll talk next time about kind of the big ticket issues. And then the next time after that, we'll talk about more of the human scaled applications. Okay?
I think really one of the more interesting sentences.
This was interesting.
Yes.
Was that very early on page 62 or 3. It said all this mess with the popes and all, the people in the pews had a lively.
That's right. That's right. It's
Yeah.
huge amounts of the geopolitical turmoil, but the devotional life of the average person is really blossoming.
Yeah.
Again, that's another reason why to call this the Dark Ages or to think about medieval being evil is really to miss a lot of the practical stuff of people, especially with their life in the church, that a lot of things are really flourishing. A lot of things were feeling very deeply personal for the first time in a long time. A lot of things that we take for granted was starting to come and really shape their daily lives in some very beautiful ways. And this is the time period.
I think they felt more self-esteem too, because Jesus, who was so humble, yet he was revered as a Lord. And as opposed to their lords, so they must be just as good as he was.
They could identify with it.
And there's definitely an
They would
element.
feel better about themselves.
There's definitely an element of human dignity, the restoration of human dignity when the humanity of Christ is reclaimed.
Mhm.
Because, if we are made in the image of God and Jesus takes on humanity, Jesus isn't just taking on the humanity of the presidents and kings. He is taking on the humanity of nobody's like me. A nobody like me is made in the image of God. And that changes a lot.
Wasn't there also a relationship, but I don't know which came first, between the going off to war with the Crusades and then fighting the little villages, when they would come and attack them,
Mhm.
like people got used to fighting and then either they didn't have the Crusades to go to, so they went to the villages, or they were doing the villages and then they sent them on the Crusades to.
It kind of comes and goes. And that's one of the really interesting things about the Crusades, especially the early Crusades. There's a real bottom up rather than top down push for the Crusades. You have these peasants who say, you mean where Jesus walked has been taken over by the Muslims? No, that is unacceptable. My wife and I and our 12 children will walk and take back the birthplace of Jesus. Like, it was very seriously taken by, we have this thought that all wars are waged by the poor average person who's being told what to do by the rich fat cat on top who never risks anything himself. The Crusades were not like that, at least not early on. The Crusades, the rich people were way less interested in the Crusades early on because I have everything to lose and nothing to gain. It is from the bottom up where people rise up. If you're not going to lead us, we're going to go ourselves because something's got to be done. Now, eventually the rich people too start getting involved. And then on later Crusades, they have reasons to get involved because, there's all this rich stuff over there and I can win fame and fortune. I can get a heavenly indulgence and I can maybe take some gold. It's win-win all the way around. But at least early on, remember the Crusades is kind of a defensive action to take back the Holy Land, but it also, this devotional life of the people that's really blossoming, the Crusades really connect into that. They are not being told by the top down, you're going to go fight this war for me that you know nothing about. They are saying, oh my gosh, I've got to do something. And if my Lord won't lead us together, we'll just go ourselves. Okay. All right. We will see you next time.
Thank you very much for enlightening this.